Hi, everybody. This is going to be an actual panel where we discuss, summarize, and think a little bit about what we already started thinking about yesterday, which is the topic of DAO science. Essentially the question of what could a science that is concerned with DAOs look like? What would the content of that science be? What are the most pressing problems that researchers would need to address? And in the other part, also to think about like how could DAO scientists essentially work together and collaborate from industry, academia, practitioners, wherever, to come together and share these results so that they may be applicable to all DAOs in the space who have needs. I'm Tara. I'm here with Metagov, and with me are Eugene, Marina, Josh, and Connor. They're all terribly nice and very, very accomplished. And maybe I think I just do a round where you guys can each introduce yourselves and what brought you here, what you do, if you're not thinking about this.
Yeah, maybe I'll start just because I have the mic. Hey everyone, nice to see you. And we're going to keep this really informal, so feel free to engage and ask questions and all of those things. We kind of see this as an extension of the session we held yesterday, which was in the very nice dungeon in the basement here, which was a very fun session, and I recognized some of you guys from that session. Connor Spelliscy, I run a group called the DAO Research Collective, and our focus is on pooling capital between DAOs and then using that capital to procure and then open source the research that we've procured. Idea being, of course, that DAOs are facing a lot of the exact same problems, so why silo that research in a community that's so into open source? So yeah, happy to chat more about that.
Hi folks, I'm Josh. I run a group called Metagov, which does research and builds standards and infrastructure for online governance, including but not limited to DAOs and Web3 in general. We do a bunch of different things, all the way from developing like software like API gateways for governance to doing ethnographic research and data science. One of the things that we've done recently, for example, is analysis of the constitutions of DAOs in Web3. We also run a standards body called DAO Star 1 that does a lot of technical work in this space.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Marina. I'm coming from the European Crypt Initiative, which is an advocacy group based in Europe, in Brussels. And what we're doing is talking to the regulators and convincing them that blockchain is awesome. So it's a very important work. It's very timely right now. And we are also doing a lot of research. This is how I would say this group is kind of connected. It's very important to use the right arguments at the right time and to understand the technical part and also all the kind of business cases and to try to convey a positive message to the regulators. So if you have any questions regarding regulation or anything linked to the European Union trying to regulate crypto, I'm happy to answer.
Hi everyone, I'm Eugene Leventhal. I'm the head of operations and outreach at the Smart Contract Research Forum. We're a grant-funded organization specifically supporting research in the Web3 space. So I was presenting earlier on the idea of decentralized research centers and what those can look like. And we're actually collaborating with a few of the organizations represented here on stage in building the first instance of one of those in the form of a DAO research hub. So yeah, if you want to talk research in the Web3 space, that's pretty much anything except market prices, like real research, underlying actual real research, then yeah, more than happy to chat about that and talk about how we're viewing research as a public good.
All right, cool. So I think maybe the first part of this panel, we should really focus on the first question that we asked ourselves yesterday in the group is what are the most pressing issues that are facing DAOs today and people working in DAOs? And I just took a look at our notes document again, and I think we have like more than 63 high-level questions, each with like little bullet points. I don't think we got to the comprehensive end of it, but question to you guys, like, where did you see the most pressing demand? Like, what was unexpected and kept resurfacing, and do you think that research could really contribute towards solving?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on one of those. So I think one that was a pretty common one was just various versions of coordination problems. And I know one that was very relevant in my mind and in Scurf's mind is very much knowledge coordination, and how do you make the relevant information available to the relevant people at the right times, and just being able to navigate kind of knowledge systems, and how do you synthesize learnings across that. And I know it was very interesting to also hear something, we were just chatting about this a little earlier, but someone specifically brought up, like there's smart contract auditing to review how smart contracts can go wrong, and making sure that whatever code is released is actually secure to some degree and verified before it's released and has money tied to it. Well, what's the governance equivalent? And I'm forgetting which ecosystem it was, but there was an exploit that pretty much like someone was able to figure out the financial threshold to like take over a network, and effectively did that in the last week at some point. So like governance is still probably one of the most pressing security concerns that is not viewed as a security concern at all. And so I think that between the coordination and governance security were sort of two that stuck out to me. I also didn't want to just take the bigger topics that might be some of the other fun ones to jump to.
I'll just add, the legal questions always come up, and we discussed about this yesterday briefly, but what I wanted to point out is that there's new things coming up. So as we knew DAOs in the past will not be the same as DAOs will be in the future. And I think this is also very important. In a way, at least in Europe, we see a lot of companies or DAOs that are incorporated also switching jurisdictions. So I think we need to have more knowledge around the legal issues about DAOs, and in a way also to be more flexible and lean in terms of the legal framework.
I guess I'll speak to something that usually Eugene emphasizes, but a large part of the conversation from yesterday's workshop revolved around questions in meta-science, or more appropriately, like ways of how exactly are we going to be organizing this DAO Science project? How do we foster research in this space, both, let's say, applied or translational research, as well as basic long-term research into the fundamental technologies that both power DAOs today, as well as ones that maybe don't exist that will power DAOs 10, even 20 years from now, right? How do we prepare those DAOs, that ecosystem for success, especially for long-term success? There are lots of questions around like publication venues, how to sort of organize grants, and one of the initiative DAO Research Hub that Eugene mentioned will include a large tranche of grants and fellowships targeted to supporting a variety of different research that will benefit DAOs in the long term. But yeah, those are, like, I think, still open questions that we're trying to figure out ourselves around how exactly to incentivize and organize and support a wide network of researchers, both based in DAOs, i.e. industry, as well as in academia.
Yeah, the one that was most surprising to me, actually, we had someone come and speak about the biggest challenge he faced, and he was maybe one of the most passionate people there, I think, and he was talking about how he was very much mission aligned with DAOs, and he and his friend had left Web 2 to move to DAOs, but a lot of them had moved back to Web 2 because they were so annoyed at the proposal process. And his question was like, how do I get my proposals passed? Which I've heard of so many times, and it's really difficult, depending on which DAO you're in, to get any traction with a proposal, even if it's valid, depending on the governance of the DAO, depending on who holds which tokens, who's actually voting, voting rights, etc. So that's a pretty straightforward one, but it's almost, it's both a governance issue and it's also an HR issue, right? It's so hard to find quality contributors to a DAO. You want to make sure that you keep any good contributors, particularly those who are participating in governance, and how do you make that happen? So that's one. And the other idea that I think is a really important one to keep in mind as we do this and we think about scaling up research, you might think, why does this matter so much? Why do we need to be really deliberate about scaling the pace at which DAOs develop from their current form? And I think a lot of this relates to what Marina was talking about from the advocacy side. So when we deal with regulators and policymakers, what you want to have in your pocket is an argument that DAOs are incredibly compelling material, they're going to change the way business is done, and if your jurisdiction doesn't participate in DAOs, then you're going to fall behind everyone else. That's usually the way you do it with regulators and policymakers, and then you talk about tax revenue, and then you talk about jobs. So DAOs are going to come under scrutiny, and they already are to some extent, kind of tangentially. We need to make sure before that happens en masse, groups like EUCI are really well funded to help regulators and policymakers understand the potential of this technology.
Great. So then also something that you guys now have touched on is advocacy and the way that we organize. And maybe to Marina or Connor, how do you see this relation between DAO research? Where does the research start, and how does it feed back into the policy cycle? What are your hopes for that? Like, how could that ideally work? And yeah.
I think there are a ton of different ways. I mean, one of the ways it helps is that if we are participating in this research now, then we're seeing the sophistication of these organizations scale such that they're ready to respond and be significant when it comes time for policymakers to understand what they're doing. So largely what happens on the policy front is there are staffers who tell members of Congress or the Senate, obviously different titles in different jurisdictions, about what's happening in the blockchain world. And we want those staffers to understand that, Maker is an amazing technology that is changing the world and they're having a huge impact. And Uniswap, there's a reason for decentralized exchanges to exist. A number of different organizations are taking different approaches, but we've also seen many of these organizations start to participate directly in advocacy. And I can say, Uniswap is very involved, and they obviously funded the DeFi Education Fund, and there are a number of other DAOs that are doing great work there. And that transition is really important because these organizations need to speak out in order to save the philosophy that we want to see live on in DAOs. We don't want to see DAOs turned into corporations because governments just don't understand them, and they're going to have the instinct to just put the round peg in the square hole. So that's one consideration, is the idea that we want this research to happen now and be made publicly available to the extent possible so that everyone can benefit and we can see this whole class of organizations move forward. And then the second piece on the advocacy side is just coming up with amazing use cases that are incredibly compelling to everyone, right? And it's funny because with on the advocacy side, when we go talk to government, and I work primarily in the United States on this, but when we go talk to government, at times we still don't have a great list of use cases that are compelling to everyone in the room, right? And that needs to change. And I know there are so many great projects out there, but people just haven't taken the time to write the summaries that outsiders or like normies or non-Web3 people would really understand. So that's another place in which the research portion of this can really contribute to the regulatory side.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's an amazing question because it's all about timing, I would say. We cannot predict what will happen in the future and how the regulators will react, but we know it can be quite time sensitive. So if we do research before, we do have all these ideas, arguments to use when we need to respond to whatever law, regulation, directive they have. And I think this is super, super useful for them. I think they also look at kind of the emerging Web3 world in a way that, if you cannot cite an academic article when you write something, it's probably not something very important, or it's not out there, or it doesn't exist. So it's kind of the things that they're used from, I would say, Web 2. And at the same time, thinking about advocacy and how you can, what are the approaches? There could be a reactive one or a proactive one. And many times we're doing the reactive approach just because of, so many things happening, especially in the last, I would say, few months, especially in Europe. And of course, we need to react to whatever drafts we have, to whatever votings we have and meetings they happen. But then the proactive one would be ideally have something that we can propose before they start thinking about the regulation. So we already have something that we thought ourselves would be the best use case or how to regulate, and then they can use it as a basis on how they would want to move on from there. So yesterday at the workshop, we also discussed and mentioned the Koala model law, which is basically a model law for DAOs that would help regulators understand how DAOs work and would be very useful for them to, let's say, write a new DAO law. Which does not exist in Europe, but I think that the Koala team has been quite successful in talking to the Australian government about this, and it's like something that is really, really useful. It's actually speaking their own language in the way they do understand, and it's making it the easiest possible for them to adopt. And I think this is how we need to kind of communicate to the regulators. In Europe, something like that would be very useful in terms of DeFi. We have the markets and crypto assets regulation that is touching upon DeFi. Ideally, the decentralized use cases would be excluded from the regulation, but we know that the DeFi regulation is coming. And so having researchers working on that, thinking about all these different aspects on the technical side, regulatory side, legal side, and also business-wise, of course, how they would connect to Web2 and other institutions and businesses that exist in Europe, that would be super, super useful. And of course, then also jumping into the mind of the regulators, what they want to see is job creations, as Connor said. They want to see competitiveness in their own jurisdictions, and this is how, in a way, you pitch whatever is happening here. We're always saying this is a space with so many bright minds, like there are so many people that are super talented and intelligent in this space, and if you don't support it from the regulatory point of view, it's just a loss for that jurisdiction, for that country, or for the union, as it is for the European Union. So definitely that would be much appreciated.
And I wanted to actually also touch on the topic of advocacy around research, but not just in like the policy and government perspective, because I know as someone for whom terms like advocacy or lobbying are very, at least in the American context, like deeply politicized and immediately make me have very strong emotions. Whereas I think that there's like a certain benefit towards advocacy that we need to think about, that it's inherent in any decentralized ecosystem. Because, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I see like, what does advocacy boil down to? It's trying to get other people to see the world more similarly to the way you see it, or convince them to be on the same page of a certain decision. And inherently, right, if we're all operating in decentralized ecosystems with non-centralized governance, that means whenever we try to get someone to vote the same way that we want to vote, that is inherently an exercise of advocacy. And I think that on the other side, just knowing and working with universities in a variety of different capacities, I think there's a lot of thirst and appetite for, I don't know a better term for it, but like the de-bullshitification of Web3, of like, groups, like faculty members don't have time to go down the degen rabbit hole and figure out what's noise and what isn't. They just need a reputable way to understand like what is quality work that's happening. Like get away the 99% of garbage that's taking the place and get me right to the punchline. And I think that right now there's this need for sort of research advocacy in grounded ways for parties that want to meaningfully affect system-level change around that. That could be regulators, that could be academic institutions understanding of like, hey, we've been really slow about committing to anything blockchain because we still think it's mostly a fad. Is it though? Like, is there enough here that we should stop treating it like a fad and we should actually put institutional money behind supporting it at the university level, and other sort of large systems like that that definitely need change, definitely want to learn more, but there are no good sources of producing this because, like, of course, if any protocol is pushing their research to a regulator, they're gonna be like, all right, sure, like, yeah, I'll believe you with a huge grain of salt because you clearly have a certain objective here. So I realize part of what I'm setting myself up for here is like, and this is why SCURF exists, which is like partially not as much in the regulatory side, but more playing for just creating like a sound basis for research-oriented discussions. But like, we'll be the first to recognize if we have no clue what the right solution to that problem is. So like, we just want to work with anyone who's trying to think about how to provide clarity of thought around research and explain it to people who don't want to go through the depth of getting it and spending, you know, the 100,000, 10,000 hours needed to like fully live in this ecosystem.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. It's just speaking about advocacy and regulators, it's actually also a very good timing for rethinking the governance of governments And like the European Union, for example, right now there's like 2 very important regulations in the process that is called a trialogue. So the European Commission, Parliament, and the Council, they do discuss about the last draft of those regulations. And there's been a process in front of the European Ombudsman regarding this process because it's not transparent, and the European citizens cannot know what's happening, what drafts have been discussed or voted on within specific committees within those institutions. So it's basically also thinking about, can we do that in a different way? Can we also use this technology to help governments govern better, whatever they would want to change? It's not only blockchain, but it's whatever regulation needs to cover.
I guess I just want to add a very brief note that we have talked about, or emphasized one way in which research sort of relates to advocacy, where advocacy is consuming research, which is then presented to regulators in order to make a kind of a certain kind of pitch, right? And I guess I come in with a different kind of bias, where really, the research is the point, and then the advocacy is the thing that gets regulators off my back, right? And I guess I want to sort of emphasize that, I think a certain part of DAO science absolutely needs to be engaged with, things like computable contracts, things where we're advancing legal technology, which is a slightly different sort of aspect of how law and where advocacy can engage with, let's say, research. I would also just emphasize that, a lot of this, and because DAOs are very much a governance technology, right? There are lots of ways, I think, in which we can focus on building the basic technology of DAOs and using research and law and even insights drawn from, let's say, the way that governments currently regulate, right? To better understand how to design better DAOs in order to expand the scope of what is possible today. Because maybe, I'll be honest, we're looking at 2 different problems. One is that, regulators could shut DAOs down or do things that are bad. But DAOs face lots and lots of other problems. And maybe the core problem that I see is that operationally, they just kind of suck right now, right? There's a lot that doesn't work in DAOs, a lot of things that are incredibly inefficient. And if we want them to be competitive in this big wide world of existing and well-lubricated, corporate, legally sort of traditional legacy entities, how do we do that? And I think that's a deeply, it's an unresolved and completely open question.
All right, so riffing off of that, we had this long list of problems yesterday, and I guess at least we all over here agree that research and solving legal and regulatory challenges are a huge step towards solving some of those problems. But maybe also the issues that DAOs are facing today, very practically, where does it stop? How much can research actually contribute towards solving that? And what other capabilities do you guys see that we also need to address these issues today? Do you see any limits? Is we just need to create DAO science and then we didn't really discuss it so much yesterday, but I'd be interested.
I guess I have, I tend to emphasize more empirical approaches. We call it DAO science. It's quite a broad term in a lot of ways. But focusing on building data sets and improving the basic infrastructure through which we evaluate and compare and validate sort of claims about DAOs. Clearly, right now, there is no validation. There's just 100 mirror posts a minute where people claim one thing and then another thing and then yet another thing, and it is a lot of noise, right? And sometimes there are really good insights and gems in these pieces, but it's hard to sift them, and it's hard to validate them, right? You just have a sense of oh, I have this experience with DAOs and this feels right, but I don't know if it is, but let's just run some, build some DAOs, see if it happens. Occasionally that, the experiments work out, but then nobody knows that it like really works out, or like why it worked out? So these are kind of questions that we need to start addressing. And the point of doing research is to sort of like figure out how do we validate these kinds of questions, right? But also a really important part is to point out that some of these questions have been asked before in other parts of, academia, research, computer science, law, and how do we connect the people that have been thinking about these questions for so long? How do we connect them into this space so that the entire space can improve and benefit from that?
We had somebody yesterday come in, I think it was Tony, talking about organizational psychology and how DAOs could learn a lot from that field and the research that has happened there before. Maybe to Eugene, what do you see as some of these fields that are very, very relevant, like also from the Smart Contracts Research Foundation? Which kind of fields do DAOs need to look in more and learn from?
Yeah, and I guess first, just adding a little more to the previous question as well before directly answering that one too. I think it's, right, because there are a couple ways to just think about like research and knowledge generation, and there are a couple of dichotomies that exist in terms of more like research or applied, or are you doing research or engineering, and like which angle do you want to take from more like pure theory or just like make stuff happen and back out theory from that? And I think both are relevant, and I know when people ask me, like, where's the best place to learn about DAOs right now? I'm like, sadly, Twitter? Like, I don't know what to tell you. But it is one of those things where we just need to think of what are the right links between the research, the engineering, and the application of these things, and how do you create culture and networks across these so that there can be appropriate experimentation at each level. And if one group tried to like do all of the research related things for all topic, like there's no way that's working. And that's why like I'm so interested in exploring the networks-based approach towards research, or what are the activities that actually should be bucketed together and create that within single networks, and then think of networks and how to combine them. So to just like offload problems to the appropriate places that can try to solve them. In terms of directly, I mean, everywhere, I guess, would be the cop-out answer. Like, I think there's so much. Like, one area that I would love to see is I would love to see DAOs hire social workers, right? And, like, school teachers, right? Like, I would love to see what a kindergarten teacher paired with a social worker can do for community management. Because at the end of the day, a lot of community management is quasi-therapeutic. It's like, well, you're just pissed off at so-and-so for whatever, so let's do a little therapy to get you over it real quick. Or certain other elements of it are just like, all right, children, let's stop being children and be adults, because we are all adults, in fact. And like these basic things, which can be shocking sometimes, of like, wow, did we just forget how to socialize because we're in a DAO? Like, what's going on? Just because like it's a decentralized ecosystem does not mean we get to like be rude to each other. And like this isn't just in decentralized ecosystems. Like I remember someone pitching me the idea of like the importance of radical transparency. And then I don't remember what, but I like threw an idea out them and they're like, no, that's stupid. I'm like, excuse me? And they're like, I'm just being radically transparent. I'm like, no, you're not. You're being mean. Like, you could have just said you disagree. You didn't need to tell me I'm stupid. Like, there's a line between those two. So I don't know, like, I think that, like, psychology is absolutely a huge domain. I think in general, like, porting over as much social science knowledge, but at the same time with, like, the peer review experiments that we're trying to do, we have to learn from everyone who's been trying to improve peer review for the last few decades. Like, we should not bulldoze our way in and be like, oh, we're doing this in Web3, so it's all brand spanking new. No, it's not. We're literally doing things that have been done in other places over and over again, and maybe we're adding a little bit of, you know, one variable is slightly different, and that's fine, and we need to be strategic in thinking about that and mapping that out to actually see and understand whether or not that's effective. Because I know we talked with a few groups that are trying to, like, totally revamp peer review, and then you look through the design decisions they're making, and it's like, how are you ever going to know what worked and what didn't? Like, assuming this goes well, how do you know what actually helped you accomplish this? There's no, like, thoughtful experimentation in that sense. So, yeah, I realize I'm veering off there, but I think there's so much from, like, the social sciences, and, yeah, I don't know if anyone else thinks of any specific topics that...
Okay, I mean, these are a little bit very hot off the press kinds of speculation. But I was literally just like going through the notes from our meeting, right? And thinking about how to organize all this stuff. Because we did essentially like a 3-hour-long DAO therapy session where we asked people, what are the problems you're encountering? These are mostly operators, though many of them do have like a scientific background. And it's like, it's notable that it's actually really hard to convert the top line problems that DAO operators perceive around like governance participation, regulatory, as well as I don't know, like certain kinds of economics, to like specific fields and like posit them as research questions that like a researcher in that field could actually sink their teeth into. I think it's more clear from the legal side because like the legal challenges are so clear and so like, like, how do I say it? Sharp. It's like, yes, I have this problem right now. Whereas things like governance participation, you could hit that from a lot of different angles, right? Political science, you could do it ethnographically. I could study like do this using game theory. There's like really like it's like when you say governance participation and how do you incentivize, that's really like 10 to 20 different like open research problems that you could tackle. Like you could literally throw 20 PhDs at it and probably still not solve it, right? So I guess I would say that like one classification that like makes sense in my head, and maybe this needs to kind of iterate a bit, is to think about, what kinds of problems are basic, right? That are amenable or, require some sort of like base level, like let's say academic approach, where you're developing theories, we're building like very, very prototype type software, or you need to do something empirical. Which ones are best suited to be solved by like developers and engineers, where you have some sort of basic research that's already complete, and the question now is like, how do I deploy this and build like a prototype that you can ship into a DAO? Which problems are, let's say, amenable to entrepreneurs and investors, where like a basic prototype or some sort of theory is already sort of like fairly well established, or maybe there's like it's really more of a market opportunity that exists as opposed to a precise kind of product or a research hypothesis. And then like, there's a certain, like entrepreneurs are fundamentally empirical, right? They go into the market, they see what works, and maybe like this is actually the right way of approaching some of these problems. And to me, that's like a certain kind of really relevant research that is better performed by the market than by like a university. It's actually really important to separate those kinds of problems from the problems, because you can't give those kinds of problems to like a scientist, right? It doesn't really work that way. Though often they do benefit with, for an entrepreneur to be collaborating with some sort of scientific body. And it's obviously one of the things we want to promote in having these research networks. And finally, there are things that can only be tackled by, let's say, like national governments, certain kinds of regulation, which I'm sure Connor and Marina can speak better about.
I just had one thought on, I mean, this is something that we talk about quite a bit. And it kind of ties in a lot of these things. One of the areas that I think we should think about when we think about governance is, of course, existing legal structures. Like appreciating that legal structures, some of which have existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, thinking about the corporate form, thinking about cooperatives and the history of cooperatives, they exist to solve a lot of the problems that we're currently facing in DAO world. And so it's funny, sometimes you're looking at how a DAO is structuring and thinking about how it's going to govern itself, and it's almost like a repudiation of everything that happened in the legacy world. But depending on the person, sometimes the team is not taking enough lessons from legacy world and appreciating that there was a reason why corporations were developed the way they were, cooperatives were developed the way they were, and thinking about the stakeholders in DAOs and what that group of stakeholders looks most similar to, what precedent is most similar, what ideas behind incentives and human behavior that hasn't really changed in the last several hundred years have informed the construction and battle-heartedness of those kind of organizations. And on that's the legal structure piece. The other piece is like governance of nations. And this is something we touched on a little bit yesterday, and Sam Hart presented on a kind of a unique challenge they're facing in the Cosmos ecosystem. And the ecosystem in Cosmos is sort of starting to look a bit less like a corporation or a corporate entity and more like a series of nations that are now working with like United Nation equivalents as well. So drawing from governance systems that have existed and have been challenged on the legal side, on the democratic side, and in so many different spaces. Other people were giving different examples yesterday, but like just not trying to completely pull from what you saw Compound do without knowing why it was that they did it, or appreciating how much time they had to make a decision, or any other DAO.
I realized that the others were talking that inspired me with two other specific things that just came to mind. One of them is I keep forgetting to actually reach out to this researcher, but I remember speaking to him a couple years back for a different project. But sort of the role of information availability in community, and how does that port over to digital communities? So there's a researcher, he was at George Mason, I actually don't know if he's still there or not, Myung Kim, but he was doing this research on sort of information deserts and what that does to local communities. Similarly to thinking about food deserts and what does that show about socioeconomic standards, and what does that show about health and availability of resources within a certain community. It's interesting to think about now. I feel like there's enough mature DAOs and you can fully map the digital presence of a DAO enough to understand like where is most actionable knowledge concentrating, and is there some kind of gating or unnecessary privilege necessary to access that information, and how does that actually play out in a system? Like maybe not everyone realizes that the bottom channel of your Discord is actually the most relevant one, and just like by not ordering it up high enough and not adding the right visibility to it, very few people are checking it, and in turn missing a ton of important information, and in turn you have a very functional specific interaction type as a result that was not intended. So like how are we literally designing the space within which people share information and knowledge, and how does that impact the interactions and ability to build social relationships in these digital ecosystems? A separate one is more trying, and before joining SCURF I was debating doing a PhD, and instead I'm now here, but nonetheless, like if I were to ever do the PhD, I would be very interested in looking at the links of existential psychotherapy and communal participation. And how do questions of meaning in life, how we define our own identity, how we create responsibility landscapes for ourselves, our loneliness and the role that plays in our lives, how did our relationship with all of these factors affect how we actually participate and opt into communities? Because those are very deep things that usually you need to go to a lot of therapy or do that, and plus some psychedelics to actually start like peeling back the layers on. And how do you actually build that as onboarding into an ecosystem, right? Like there's no good pathway to be like, you want to join? What's your meaning in life? Right? It's gonna be like, what are you talking about? This sounds like a cult. I'm okay, thank you. So I think that like actually understanding those links better, on the one hand, can create healthier communities, but as soon as I say that phrase, I get very scared by just like the marketing data approach towards that kind of knowledge. And then do you just get to spam people in a more targeted way, which would make me very upset. So that's yeah, and I also think we also have to be cognizant of like the moral character of any research topics that we delve into, because we can't just look at the positive upside and be like, yeah, the negative will be someone else's problem. We're just doing it for all the right reasons. It's like, yeah, if only life worked that way, right? If you create new tools or new ideas, you have to be willing to sleep at night with the realities of how they can be used in the most horrific way possible as well. So on that positive note, back to you, Tara.
Yeah, so you mentioned therapy. And as Marina was saying, we had a little therapy session in that sense. And I guess one of the topics that also kept coming up, and I'd like to discuss a little bit in terms of legal stuff, was like, are these DAO people okay? Like well-being, is everybody doing all right? And there were quite a few issues that came up, like we don't want to repeat the gig economy. We do want to have some sort of stability. It is a lot of work, like pushing these proposals and that sort of thing. And I feel a lot of times when we discuss the legal issues, it's about incorporating and about protecting workers, yes, but maybe also from a worker protection and labor regulation perspective. Do you have any opinions, like how can we bring that more into DAOs, or also how could, like what sort of research would we have to do, what sort of advocacy would we have to do to help manage this well-being aspects of people within DAOs, because it does seem to be an issue. And again, I do think there are things outside that we have developed for years and years and years that maybe we can plug into. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you. So I think there might be a legal way to look into this problem, but I don't think it's the most important one. It's basically what we can do within the organizations, and you know, I don't want to talk about, you know, leaders or managers or whatever within DAOs, but like how do we take care about each other and about how much time we spend on certain things, and how do we take care of ourselves. So I think this is something that anyone that wants to join a DAO needs to be mindful of. because I think that our brains are like so, I don't know, like we're so interested in so many different things. We want to learn everything. We meet at these conferences and we're like, oh my God, I need to Google so many things, and I need to, you know, schedule a call and you know, read this paper, and then, you know, it happens that it's too much at the same time. We've seen over all these years, blockchain developed in so many different ways. There's so many different things to learn, new blockchains, like new elements, new tech. Even from the legal point of view, there's so many things happening that in a way you need to decide for yourself, like how much time do I have and what is like my, I would say, mental and like psychological capacity to do this. There was also discussion with comparing with the VR world. And even if you use VR, I think you can use it for 30 minutes or something like this. And if you do for longer, it doesn't really work with how humans are built. And I think that might be very similar when you think about how many Discord channels are you in at the moment? How much time do you spend reading Discord messages during a day, or a combination of I don't know, Signal, Telegram, and Discord messages. My friend just tweeted yesterday, she's spending 2 hours reading and responding to Signal messages per day. And that's a lot. And that means that if you spend 2 hours just, you know, responding to messages, it's 2 hours that you cannot do, I don't know, you know, writing anything or being in meetings. And maybe this is something that we don't see as work. When it comes to the legal question, it is quite challenging because all of those organizations are so global. We come from all over the world, and this is why it's so magical and interesting to work in this space. But then the legal frameworks are super different. Like the European one is different from the US one. I've also been discussing with my legal colleagues about this. From the European perspective, might not be that challenging because even as a freelancer, you still have like healthcare and stuff like that. But there, as I know, maybe Connor can tell more about this, there are solutions that are specifically built for this in the US to actually, you know, have solutions that would facilitate also this kind of legal challenges within DAOs and working with an international community and international team in a way.
Yeah, I would say this is actually where the interaction between the legal part and the, like, kind of what we were talking about earlier. When regulators are looking at DAOs, they might see organizations that are not paying taxes, don't have that many employees in their jurisdiction, and are also violating employment laws. So I think that a good place to start is almost like we've developed employment laws over years in Europe and in the United States and Canada, you know, in Asia, across the world, and there's a reason for their existence, but it's impossible at times for organizations like DAOs that don't have an entity to be compliant with these laws. And I've been seeing some great growth of organizations. One is Work DAO, which I've been working with a bit recently. They just reached out to me at ETH Denver, and I hadn't heard of the team before, but they've done all the horrible work that a lot of us at DAOs don't like doing, which is going jurisdiction to jurisdiction and finding employers of record and finding how they could be compliant so that their organization can be the one that is the employer of record in different jurisdictions. They can pay health insurance to U.S. employees, and the regulations in the U.S. vary not only by the country, but also state by state, which is incredibly painful if you're a DAO that has workers around the world. It's almost impossible for you to be able to comply with that, or it's going to take up half the cost and, you know, time of your existence. So organizations like that are actually helping us on the advocacy side, as well as helping us on almost the operational side at DAOs. And it's really nice to see those organizations emerge. And we actually had someone mentioned yesterday about the, I can't remember the word used, but it was something about like the inconsistency in wages maybe for those who work in DAOs. And I think that is a huge issue too. Like when we think about how we pay contributors, you know, I work at some DAOs where I just get sent a bit of a bit of crypto every once in a while, you know, and I'm fine with that because maybe I have other gigs which like are more standard, but I could appreciate that if you're just kind of waiting for the next drop from the DAO, right? And that inconsistency is something that's maybe at times not captured in law, but to Marina's point, it really impacts lifestyle and also like sustainability of these organizations.
Yeah, and also on the well-being side, I mean, what you were mentioning just in terms of like the 2 hours of signal a day, that is unfortunately hitting a deep note there, right? Because I imagine everyone here, it's like if we actually did a poll of how many people use Signal, Telegram, Discord, Slack, email, probably multiple emails, especially if you're working at like 12 different DAOs, then you need 12 different Discord, right? And like just the sheer information volume that we have to manage, I feel like is just unhealthy fundamentally. And like, right, Josh and I were chatting earlier today about like the role of an Apple Watch and whether or not that is a healthy addition into one's life. And right, like having those notifications, you need some way to surface them, but at the same time staying on top of it becomes its own job. And it just seems as though there's so much focus that's needed on how do we create healthy work cultures, because there's a few forces that are very much at tension right now. On the one side, there's, you know, it's a very opportunity-rich landscape. There's so many cool things going on, and at least once a week, I'm like, I should be doing less stuff. And then all these things come up, and I'm like, well, I can't say no to that. Like, when is that gonna happen again, right? So even just being able to say no in an opportunity-rich landscape and time, because we all, you know, even for those of us who have been in the space for, you know, let's say anyone's here from 09, like 2010, of like literally from the start of blockchains and the beginnings of Web3 with Bitcoin, if anyone's been around that long, it's still a decade. It's not that long, right? Like AI has been around 50 some odd years. You know, TCP/IP and the basic protocols of the internet started in like the late 60s and whatnot with ARPANET, or into 70s. But I still think there's so much evolution on the tech side that is coming, and we have placed ourselves by being at events like this, by playing around in DAOs, by being in this kind of space. We are inherently going to be swamped by opportunity for many more months, if not years. And how do we create a reasonable balance of like not giving in to the FOMO and not the fear of missing out and being worried that this is my last chance to do whatever it is that motivates all of us individually. And just be okay with turning things away and turning off your phone and being like, you know what's the most important thing that I do today? Nothing. I need to go focus on my mental health and just be a human and go socialize and like do regular people things. And I just think that like the deeper we get into the bulk of our social network being entirely digital, and we're combined in a few of these networks where like reputation starts slowly garnering, and like, why are you acting this way or that way? And if you're active and then you disappear, and then like there's just so many different considerations that come into it. And even just being able to like confidently communicate of like, hey, I don't work weekends, hard stop. Or like, I have kids, I can't do stuff at night, hard stop. And like being able to set that up, because not everyone is a privileged 20-something with no responsibilities besides have fun on the internet. And so like, how do we actually help people who are single parents get into this space? Like, until a single mom or dad can get into Web3 comfortably, I don't think this is an accessible space. And so like, that's one of those things where how do we create these pathways to accessibility? And it starts by those of us who are already here thinking, how do we carve out spaces for actual healthy work-life balance, whatever the heck that means. And like, I know I'm a workaholic naturally. It's a bad tendency that I have. And like, that is a thing I need to work through. But especially if I am now responsible for setting culture in a community, how do I not unintentionally make people feel like, ooh, I got to work as much as that crazy dude in order to be like accepted here? And it's like, no, like please work less. That's totally fine. But like, again, how do you build these norms when you don't have a centralized point of like, well, let me tell you our culture, right? So it's like, it's just a very interesting like hodgepodge of challenges on challenges that I think come down to like, we just need more honest, open public discussions. And like, the more we can have talks like this, especially within our communities, across communities, the more we can try to set cultural standards that supersede any single organization, which will then hopefully lead to healthier standards.
Hopefully, yeah. Hell yeah. I think we have like 15 minutes left on this panel. I just want to check if you guys have any questions relating to these problems that we discussed, the legal stuff, the well-being. Is everybody doing okay?
We can do a group therapy session.
Yeah, therapy is our thing.
Thanks. So being a DAO scientist, so I'm from Delft University of Technology, so we've been running a master program with a few courses for a while. So one of the things, if you want to get professors involved in you call it DAO Science, so what are the interesting scientific problems, and indeed what are just engineering problems? Because a lot of the things I've seen is like you're trying to redo the Web 2 world. There's not a lot of awareness of what computer science has done already. But the real, so okay, you've solved double spending, but a probabilistic solution. So a lot of things that is done here, a lot of my colleague professors in the field will not actually like to work on it. So you really have to bribe them with a lot of millions in order to get them, sadly.
I guess I'll gladly start with that one. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting point and very relevant in terms of how do you not just create the financial incentives, but I guess in my mind, there's also the element of how do you map the problem statements and make that known of like, here's what academics are interested in working on. Here's what people in DAOs are currently needing help with. And then try to think of, and again, I guess shameless plug for Scurf, right? Like who then starts being that matchmaker between the two? Well, we were funded exactly for that kind of purpose of just like, what does creating better facilitation at that point with like, hey, we're not trying to monetize, we are never gonna launch a token, we're not playing any of those games. We just wanna say, here's what the DAOs have problems with, here's what the cryptographers have problems with, here's what the economists are working on. Like, how do we actually map out the knowledge spaces and the engineering spaces that are actively being experimented in? And then start being like, ooh, well, maybe an economist should go over here and let's bring a governance discussion there. And like, how do we keep facilitating the right interactions and then create separate funding channels, whether it's, some crypto orgs are still like 10K can be meaningful for university. It's like, especially not in the States. Like where a lot of the time to fund a PhD student, it's at least 100, 125 grand. So, and that's for a student. So then like you need to create meaningful funding channels. And that's where I know where we're excited with working on the DAO Research Hub is how can we create a funnel of both the knowledge of problems as well as a funnel of funding and an operational layer to connect the dots across all of those. And we haven't done it yet, so I can't tell you the data of like how it went, but these are the kinds of experiments that we want to run. And I definitely want to chat with you later because I know Delft is doing a lot of cool stuff, so it would be great to speak more. But yeah, I think in working with more universities and hearing directly from folks of what are the problems that you are not seeing someone solve, and then helping to connect with the right groups that want to solve those problems, we might need years of building infrastructure before we get to the actual engineering applied level of change happening. And not everyone is going to be excited by that, but at least for those that are comfortable with building long-term meaningful relationships and systems, like I think you need to be comfortable taking the long view, whether or not that's the fun answer. I don't know if anyone else.
I would just say that, speaking as like a computer scientist, you often notice in the university, like a lot of people have a hard time getting out of the lab, right? Or they, they perceive, they speak to certain industries that are already out there who have these problems, and they put them in front of them, and they have a sense of like, this is what is important. And I think what I would really want to do is encourage like people, I guess communities of researchers, thinking about these basic problems to understand like how those problems can be applied and are relevant within this very much emerging industry, right? Emerging sort of like community, a practice of DAOs and the experiments that they're running. And I think there's not only interesting research questions based there that are, could become papers, but also just like raw data sets that are really valuable, especially, just the fact that everything's not only digital, but like on a blockchain, so it's public, and then there's this additional ethos of publishing your data and being completely open source. It just makes this, I think, a really fruitful domain for lots of different research, and it's enabling certain kinds of research that, like, the most comparable thing I think about is like, like governance of online communities, circa like 90s or 2000s in like the original virtual worlds, right? But the kinds of things that are happening today are just like qualitatively different, I think, from the kinds of experiments and patterns that you could observe in those game worlds, just because, let's just face it, so much more money is involved, and that really changes behavior, and it allows just different kinds of let's say, like secondary patterns to develop, not only in human behavior, but in technological behavior, in the kinds of conditions and engineering you're going to see in these systems, or could possibly see.
All right, great. Does anybody else have a question? Do you want to? Yeah, I got it. Thanks.
Thank you for such an interesting discussion. From what I know, actually the regulators is starting to become very open-minded for the blockchain area and also for DAOs, I guess. So my question is, what do you think, where the CBDC gonna go in this field? Or where the fiat digital currency gonna be integrated in DAOs? How do you think the two parties gonna be balanced? Thank you.
Who's going to take this?
Yeah, I'll try. We don't know. So I think it's really hard, but I can kind of translate or map what's happening at the moment and what are the trends and where everything is going in Europe. So there is nothing, as far as I know, as a new law or maybe kind of a update of the existing laws on DAOs. So the DAO incorporation struggle or non-incorporation struggle is still going to be here for the next few years at least. There is a new regulation, the Markets in Crypto Assets regulation, that regulates issuance of tokens. So if a DAO is linked to a token that the DAO would want to issue, probably is going to be in a way regulated within this regulation, which in one of the drafts requires the issuers also to be incorporated in Europe, so in one of the European member states. And then the other thing, the digital euro, where we are at the moment, is that there is a public call for feedback at the moment, yeah. So we're working on it with EUCI. I think the deadline is somewhere in June. And then the European Commission and the EBA, they're going to collect this feedback and work on this. I think at the end of this year, we can expect more activities in this regard. But we don't know how the digital euro is going to actually look like. We don't know if it's going to be in any way connected with blockchain. So it's still an open question. And I think the most important part here is actually the interoperability between the digital, fiat money and the space of blockchain, DeFi, etc. So that would be basically, I would say, the best outcome that we can imagine. But there are other questions and other things coming up as the AML regulation, which is also going to impact all of the activities that the DAOs are going to work on, especially if they're going to use wallets or unhosted wallets, as they call them.
From the U.S. side, it's the U.S. and Canadian side. I mean, I think that policymakers in the U.S. have just completely shifted in the last year and a half, and appreciate now that. And in the narrative, you'll hear a lot said in the Congress is that this will help us maintain dollar dominance. So they understand that if USDC pegged to the U.S. dollar with exclusively USD reserves is going to become the currency of the globe, which is kind of started to do now, then they're going to maintain and maybe even encourage dollar dominance going forward. And that's what we're seeing happen there. So the controversy comes like in the States as maybe a country that encourages more private market operation. I think we're less likely to see a CBDC, or maybe we'll have instead just a few different private stablecoins which are backed in USD and maybe like some very low risk other assets. But as it relates to decentralized stablecoins, I think that's where the fight is really going to be coming, and the extent to which those organizations have to do battle with government and prove why they should continue to existing. And I'm a big fan of them, but it's going to be more difficult for them than centralized.
Just a fun fact, I think there's like 98% of all the stablecoins are backed by a dollar. So we cannot talk about any maybe existing stablecoins that are backed by the euro. And when the regulators hear that, it kind of hurts. So we're going to play on that one, that card.
And I just wanted to just quickly add, I know from just speaking to a variety of faculty members, at least in the States, I know a number of Federal Reserves in the US have commissioned various universities to run projects on what are the impacts of CBDCs. I know several banks have reached out to a number of universities in the States to be like, hey, effectively, what's our role in the CBDC future if we switch to a digital dollar and the Fed can issue money directly in that kind of way? What role do all banks play in that kind of ecosystem? And that's still a bit of an open question. And an interesting point that I heard, because sort of I feel like there's been no real major public discussions that I've heard that have been focused on CBDC governance, and what does that actually mean, and how do citizens have any say in what happens with digital currency or anything to that effect. And an interesting model that was brought up, at least in the States, is the fact that Zelle, for anyone who uses like the banking system in the States, of like it was their comeback to Venmo, and like how can you effectively Venmo bank-to-bank kind of transactions. Their governance structure apparently is pretty interesting, where they have both a top down from the government layer and a bottom up from all of the banks layer. And so I haven't actually had a chance to explore this more deeply, but it's interesting to start thinking of what are the closest models of multiple banks managing a currency, reporting to a government, but still in some form, at least in the US via shareholder model, being in some way beholden to the people. And there's a lot of arguments to be had as to whether or not that's actually happening. But theoretically, just how do we start thinking about CBDCs in an actual system construction perspective that isn't just like the government running all of it as a surveillance tool more so than like digital currency.
All right, great. I think we're almost at time, and just being mindful of everybody's well-being. I'd say we get towards the end, but as like a last question, and maybe something we didn't talk about so much right now, is the whole aspect, how are we going to organize the DAO Science? Like, what is this practically going to look like for you? Maybe we can do like a little closing round where yeah, I'd love to hear what's the future of DAO Science, and how can people expect to be involved, or thoughts and plans?
Yeah, I hate that this is my answer, but Discord or Telegram? Like, we need some way to actually coordinate. I know, I hate that answer as much as you do, trust me. But like, we do actually need some way of like humans to be aware of what's initially happening until we have larger, better systems in place. So like, this is all very new and undefined. So we did create a DAO Research Hub Telegram group. Yay. Yay, more telegrams, right? But like, we do need some way to actually coordinate, and we actively want to build more focused research networks, whether it's amongst just faculty members, just industry folks. How do we build bridges across those? So I think sort of the communication tools and the networks are at least the first steps that I'm really excited about.
From my point of view, I'm also inviting everyone that wants to contribute to a research regarding European regulation, but not about regulation, more from the maybe technical perspective, or at least use case perspective. And yeah, that's something that I think it's very important, at least for the next year in Europe. And it will basically define the future of DAOs, DeFi, everything that is a little bit more interesting in this space. And I think that if anyone is already working on this or is interested, just reach out to us, the European Crypt Initiative, and we'll be happy to talk to you.
Maybe I'll let Connor talk about the DAO Research Hub specifically, but I think one of the outputs of this workshop specifically that I would really like to emphasize, and maybe draw contributions from the people here, especially any researchers, is a large survey paper of the open problems in DAO Science, covering a wide span of different disciplines, from law to computer science to economics to political science, that basically matches between the problems posed by, let's say, DAO operators in the industry, and tries to refine those into research questions that could be feasibly addressed by scientists and researchers. I mean, typically based in an academic context, but not necessarily. The point is to do that matchmaking and to articulate, these are the open problems in DAO Science that you as researchers, or even as entrepreneurs and investors, could potentially tackle and make high impact contributions to this field that, let's say, have a high chance of being taken up by industry and by other researchers.
Yeah, so Josh mentioned the DAO Governance Hub, and that's something that we at the DAO Research Collective, as well as Eugene at SCURF and Josh at Metagov, are working on together. You know, issues that we're seeing, and I'm sure a lot of you are seeing as well, like the duplication, the noise. These are all pieces that we deal with every day, the connection between institutions and academics and industry. And so I won't go into all the detail about the organization, but I think you get the gist. It's pooling resources so that we can figure out how to procure, how to open source research, and do so in a way that allows us to scale DAOs much more quickly. So happy to chat more on that with any of you that are interested.
All right, well, with that, thank you guys for this super interesting conversation. I guess we have a lot of problems to solve starting now. Thanks everybody for coming, also for those who joined the workshop yesterday. And obviously also to all the DAOists here for organizing this lovely, lovely conference. So yeah.
Thanks all. Thanks, Tara.